3 True Church Horror Stories. Story 1. The Midnight Congregation. Sarah had always been proud of her job as a church cleaner. For 15 years, she'd maintained St. Michael's Parish, a beautiful stone church built in 1847. The pay wasn't much, but she loved the peaceful atmosphere and the sense of purpose it gave her. She usually worked during the day, but when Father Martinez asked if she could switch to night shifts to avoid disrupting Sunday services, she agreed without hesitation. The first few weeks went smoothly. Sarah would arrive at 11 p.m., clean the pews, mop the floors, and polish the altar. She'd finish around 3 a.m. and drive home through the empty streets. The church felt different at night, more sacred somehow, as if the darkness amplified the holy presence within its walls. It was on a Thursday in October when Sarah first noticed something strange. She was dusting the front pews when she heard what sounded like whispering coming from the back of the church. She stopped and listened carefully, but the sound had vanished. Thinking it might be the old heating system, she continued her work. The following week, the whispers returned. This time they were clearer, multiple voices speaking in hushed tones. Sarah walked toward the back of the church, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. As she got closer, the voices stopped abruptly. She checked behind the last row of pews and found nothing. The heavy wooden doors were still locked from the inside. "Hello?" she called out softly, feeling foolish. Only silence answered her. Sarah tried to convince herself it was her imagination. She'd been working nights for a month now, and maybe the lack of sleep was getting to her. But deep down she knew what she'd heard was real. The third time it happened, Sarah was ready. She'd brought a small flashlight and positioned herself near the back of the church while she worked. Around 1:30 a.m. the whispers began again. This time she could make out words, Latin phrases she recognized from Mass. But there was something wrong with the voices. They sounded old, ancient even, and there was an urgency to them that made her skin crawl. Sarah crept closer, her flashlight beam dancing across the empty pews. The whispers grew louder, and she realized they were coming from beneath her feet. The church had a basement. She'd been down there once to check the circuit breaker, but Father Martinez had told her it was sealed off because of structural problems. Her hands shaking, Sarah found the basement door hidden behind the organ. To her shock, it was slightly ajar. She was certain it had been locked before. The whispers were definitely coming from down there now, along with a musty smell that reminded her of old graves. Every instinct told her to leave, to call Father Martinez, to do anything but go down those stairs. But something compelled her forward. A mixture of curiosity and a strange feeling that she was meant to discover whatever was down there. The basement was larger than she remembered, extending far beyond what should have been possible given the church's footprint above. Her flashlight revealed stone walls covered in strange symbols that definitely weren't Christian. In the center of the room stood a circle of people dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their backs to her. Sarah's blood turned to ice. The people weren't moving, weren't breathing. They were completely still, yet the whispers continued to flow from their direction. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could see that their clothes were rotting, hanging in tatters from skeletal frames. One of the figures began to turn around. Sarah ran. She dropped her flashlight and ran up those stairs faster than she'd ever moved in her life. She burst through the church doors and into the parking lot, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, she could swear she heard footsteps on the church floor, slow and deliberate. She called Father Martinez from her car, sobbing into the phone about what she'd seen. He arrived 20 minutes later, his face grave. Together they went back into the church. The basement door was locked tight, just as it should have been. Father Martinez's key wouldn't even turn. The lock seemed rusted solid. "Sarah," he said quietly, "this church was built on the site of an older building. Before it was consecrated, there were other practices here. Dark things. We thought they were gone." He pulled out a leather-bound journal from his coat. "I've been researching the history since you mentioned the whispers. In 1923, a group of people performed rituals in the basement. They were trying to contact something that should never be contacted. The ritual went wrong. All 12 participants were found dead, arranged in a circle. Sarah stared at him in horror. 12? Father, I counted 13 figures down there. Father Martinez went pale. That's impossible. There were only 12. They never found out who the 13th figure was. The church was reconsecrated the following week, and the basement was sealed with concrete. Sarah found a new job cleaning office buildings. She never worked in a church again, but sometimes on quiet Thursday nights, she still hears whispers in Latin, and she knows that somewhere beneath St. Michael's Parish, 13 figures stand in an eternal circle, waiting for someone else to find them. The church still operates today. The new cleaning lady works during the day. Story 2. The Confession. Booth Detective Mike Rodriguez had seen a lot of disturbing things in his 20 years on the force, but nothing had prepared him for the case at Our Lady of Sorrows Catholic Church. It started with a missing person report. Father Thomas Brennan, age 45, had vanished without a trace on a Tuesday evening in March. Father Brennan was well loved in the community. He'd served at Our Lady of Sorrows for 8 years, known for his compassionate nature and his willingness to listen to anyone who needed help. His disappearance shocked everyone who knew him. The last person to see Father Brennan alive was Mrs. Elena Vasquez, an elderly parishioner who'd come for evening confession. She told Rodriguez that everything seemed normal when she left around 7 p.m. Father Brennan had been in good spirits, even joking about the church's old heating system. Rodriguez began his investigation in the church itself. Our Lady of Sorrows was built in the 1960s, a modern structure with clean lines and large windows. Nothing seemed out of place in the main sanctuary or the priest's living quarters. The office showed no signs of struggle, and Father Brennan's car was still in the parking lot. It was Rodriguez's partner, Detective Lisa Chen, who first noticed something odd about the confession booth. The wooden structure sat in a corner of the church, divided into 2 sections, one for the penitent and one for the priest. The door to the priest's side was slightly ajar, which struck Chen as unusual. Priests are pretty careful about keeping things tidy, she observed. Why would he leave this open? Rodriguez peered inside the priest's compartment. It was cramped and dark, with a small bench and a sliding wooden panel that separated it from the penitent's side. Everything looked normal except for some scratches on the wooden walls, long, deep gouges that looked fresh. These looked like fingernail marks, Rodriguez said, running his finger along the scratches. Like someone was trying to claw their way out. They called in the forensics team, who confirmed traces of blood on the scratches. DNA testing would take weeks, but Rodriguez had a sinking feeling they belonged to Father Brennan. The real breakthrough came when Rodriguez interviewed more parishioners. He learned that for the past month, several people had complained about strange experiences in the confession booth. Maria Santos, a regular churchgoer, told him about her last confession 3 weeks earlier. I went in as usual, she said, wringing her hands nervously. But when Father Brennan started talking, his voice sounded different. Deeper respire, and he knew things about me that I'd never confessed to anyone. Private things, shameful things from my childhood. Another parishioner, David Kim, had a similar story. The father asked me about sins I'd never committed. Terrible things. When I told him he was wrong, he laughed. It wasn't Father Brennan's laugh. It was cold and cruel. Rodriguez felt a chill run down his spine. He'd been raised Catholic and knew that the sanctity of confession was paramount. Something was very wrong here. The investigation took a bizarre turn when Rodriguez decided to spend a night alone in the church. He'd gotten permission from the bishop and had positioned himself in a pew with a clear view of the confession booth. Around midnight, he heard the sound of the booth's door creaking open. Rodriguez watched in disbelief as a figure emerged from the priest's side of the booth. At first, he thought it was Father Brennan. The height and build were right, and the person wore the familiar black clerical shirt. But as the figure moved into the dim light from the sanctuary lamp, Rodriguez saw that something was horribly wrong. The face was Father Brennan's, but twisted and distorted. The eyes were completely black, and the mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin. The thing that looked like Father Brennan turned toward Rodriguez and their eyes met. "Would you like to make a confession, detective?" it said in a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed. Rodriguez drew his weapon, but the figure had already vanished. He searched the entire church but found nothing. The confession booth stood empty and silent. The next morning, Rodriguez contacted the diocesan office and spoke with Bishop Morrison. The bishop listened to his report with growing concern. "Detective," the bishop said quietly, "there's something you need to know about that confession booth. It was donated to the church 5 years ago by the estate of a man named Marcus Caney. Caney was a former priest who'd been defrocked for disturbing activities." Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. What kind of activities? Caney claimed he could absolve people of sins they hadn't committed yet. He believed he could take on their future transgressions and carry them into the afterlife. The church found evidence that he was psychologically manipulating parishioners, convincing them they were guilty of terrible things. Several people had nervous breakdowns. One person committed suicide. The bishop continued. Before his death, Caney became obsessed with the idea that confession booths were portals, doorways between the world of the living and the realm of judgment. He spent months modifying that particular booth, carving symbols into the wood and performing unauthorized rituals inside it. Rodriguez stared at the bishop. "Are you telling me that booth is haunted?" "I'm telling you that evil can sometimes attach itself to objects, especially ones that have been corrupted by dark intentions. And I'm afraid that Father Brennan may have encountered something that was waiting. Inside that booth, they brought in a team of specialists, both forensic, experts and clergy trained in dealing with supernatural phenomena. Inside the confession booth's walls, they found a hidden compartment containing Father Brennan's personal effects and a journal written in his handwriting. The final entry, dated the day he disappeared, was barely legible. It speaks to me now even when no one is here for confession. It knows my sins, my doubts, my fears. It promises to take them away if I let it in completely. I can feel it growing stronger, feeding on the guilt of everyone who enters this booth. God help me, I don't think I can fight it much longer." Father Brennan's body was never found. The confession booth was removed and destroyed, blessed with holy water and burned to ash. The church was reconsecrated, and a new priest was assigned to the parish. But the parishioners who'd used that confession booth were never quite the same. They carried a haunted look in their eyes, as if they'd glimpsed something beyond the veil of normal reality. And sometimes, late at night, people walking past Our Lady of Sorrows swear they can still hear the sound of whispered confessions coming from the empty corner where the booth once stood. Rodriguez retired from the force 2 years later. He never spoke publicly about what he'd seen that night, but those close to him noticed that he'd stopped going to church entirely. When pressed about his faith, he would only say that some doors once opened can never truly be closed again. Story 3. The Children's Choir Grace Community Church had always been proud of their children's choir. For over 30 years, the Sweet Voices of Grace had been a cornerstone of Sunday services, their angelic harmonies bringing tears to the eyes of the congregation. The choir was made up of children ages 6 to 12, and being selected was considered a great honor in the community. Margaret Foster had been the choir director for 15 years when she first noticed something was wrong. It was a Sunday in late September, and the children were practicing their hymns for the upcoming Harvest Festival. As usual, the 22 young voices blended together beautifully, creating the kind of pure sound that only children can produce. But as Margaret conducted, she became aware of an additional voice in the mix. At first, she thought one of the children was singing off-key, but as she listened more carefully, she realized there was a 23rd voice joining the choir. The voice was definitely that of a child, but it had a hollow, distant quality that made her skin crawl. Margaret stopped the rehearsal and counted the children. 22, just as there should be. She asked if anyone had heard an extra voice, but the children just looked at her with confused expressions. 8-year-old Tommy Chen raised his hand. "Mrs. Foster, who's the new girl in the back row?" he asked innocently. Margaret turned to look where Tommy was pointing, but saw only empty space behind the last row of children. Her heart began to race. "What new girl, Tommy?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "The one with the white dress and the long hair," Tommy replied. "She's been singing with us for weeks now. She knows all the words." Several other children nodded in agreement. 9-year-old Sarah Martinez chimed in. "Yeah, she's really good. But she never talks to us before or after practice." Margaret felt a chill run through her body. She'd been directing every rehearsal for weeks, and there had never been a new girl. Moreover, the children were describing seeing someone that wasn't there. After rehearsal, Margaret spoke with Pastor Williams about what had happened. He listened with growing concern, especially when she mentioned that multiple children claimed to see and hear this mysterious girl. "Margaret," Pastor Williams said slowly, "I think you need to know something about this church's history. Before you started directing the choir, we had another music director named Helen Cartwright. She worked here for over 20 years. Margaret had heard Helen's name mentioned before, but had never learned much about her predecessor. "What happened to her?" she asked. Pastor Williams's face grew somber. "Helen had a daughter named Lucy. 8 years old, blonde hair, always wore white dresses to church. Lucy was the star of the children's choir, had the voice of an angel. In 1995, there was a terrible accident. The pastor explained that Lucy and her mother had been driving home from evening choir practice when their car was hit by a drunk driver. Helen survived with minor injuries, but Lucy was killed instantly. Helen never recovered from the loss. She became obsessed with the idea that Lucy's spirit was still in the church, still wanting to sing with the choir. Helen started claiming she could hear Lucy's voice during rehearsals." Pastor Williams continued. "She'd conduct empty spaces, insisting Lucy was there. The children began to get frightened. Parents complained. Eventually, we had to let Helen go. She moved away shortly after, and we never heard from her again." Margaret felt her blood run cold. "Pastor, that was over 20 years ago. The children in my choir wouldn't know anything about Lucy Cartwright." "That's what troubles me," Pastor Williams replied. Over the following weeks, more children began reporting interactions with the mysterious girl. 10-year-old Emma Rodriguez told Margaret that the girl had whispered to her during practice, asking her to sing louder so everyone can hear us both. 7-year-old Michael Torres claimed the girl had asked him to save her a seat, even though she never seemed to sit down. The children's descriptions were remarkably consistent. They all described a girl about 8 years old with long blonde hair and a white dress. She knew all the hymns and had a beautiful voice, but she never spoke much and always seemed sad. Margaret tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe the children were influenced by each other's stories, creating a kind of group hysteria, but she couldn't explain away what she was experiencing herself. During every rehearsal, she could clearly hear that 23rd voice, sweet and pure, but somehow wrong. The situation escalated during a Sunday morning service in November. The children's choir was performing their arrangement of Amazing Grace when Margaret noticed something that made her freeze with terror. In the church's large windows, which reflected the interior during the day, she could see the outline of a small figure standing behind the children, a girl in a white dress. Margaret's hands began to shake as she continued conducting. The reflection became clearer and she could see the girl's face. She was pale and translucent, but definitely present. The girl was singing along with the choir, her mouth moving in perfect synchronization with the hymn. After the service, Margaret approached some of the adult congregation members who'd been watching the choir. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who'd attended Grace Community for 40 years, pulled Margaret aside. "Dear," she said quietly, "I don't know if I should mention this, but during the performance, I could have sworn I saw little Lucy Cartwright standing with your choir." Margaret's heart nearly stopped. "You knew Lucy?" "Oh yes, she was such a sweet child. Sang like an angel. It broke all our hearts when she passed. But I know what I saw today, and that was Lucy's spirit, clear as day. That evening, Margaret did some research at the local library. She found newspaper articles about the accident that had killed Lucy Cartwright and discovered something that chilled her to the bone. The accident had occurred on November 15th, 1995, exactly 27 years ago to the day of the service where Margaret had seen Lucy's reflection. Armed with this information, Margaret returned to Pastor Williams. Together, they decided to investigate further. They arranged to meet with Helen Cartwright, who they'd tracked down to a nursing home 2 towns over. Helen was now in her 70s, frail and confused, but her eyes lit up when they mentioned Lucy and the children's choir. "She's still there, isn't she?" Helen asked eagerly. "I knew she wouldn't leave. Lucy loved that choir more than anything. She used to practice the hymns at home every night." Helen revealed something that made Margaret's blood run cold. Before the accident, Lucy was supposed to sing a solo during the Christmas service. She'd been practicing Silent Night for weeks. She was so excited about it. Margaret realized that Christmas was approaching and she'd been planning to feature solo performances during the holiday service. Was Lucy's spirit trying to fulfill her final wish? The next choir rehearsal confirmed Margaret's fears. As the children practiced Christmas carols, the 23rd voice became stronger and more prominent. During Silent Night, it seemed to take over completely, drowning out the living voices with an otherworldly beauty that was both magnificent and terrifying. Tommy Chen raised his hand again. "Mrs. Foster, the girl wants to know if she can sing the solo for Christmas. She says she's been practicing." Margaret made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. On Christmas Eve, during the candlelight service, she allowed the children's choir to perform Silent Night as planned. But this time, instead of assigning the solo to one of her living students, she conducted toward the empty space where the children claimed to see Lucy. The church fell completely silent as a pure, ethereal voice filled the sanctuary. It was the voice of a child, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The congregation sat in stunned amazement as the invisible presence sang the beloved carol with heartbreaking beauty. When the song ended, Margaret saw something that brought tears to her eyes. In the church window's reflection, Lucy Cartwright smiled at her. The first time Margaret had seen the spirit look happy. Then, gradually, the image faded away. Lucy never appeared to the choir again. The 23rd voice was gone, and the children stopped asking about their mysterious friend. Helen Cartwright passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 days after Christmas, a smile on her face. Margaret continued directing the children's choir for another 10 years before retiring. She never told anyone the full truth about what happened that Christmas Eve, but she never forgot the lesson Lucy taught her, that love, even from beyond the grave, can transcend death itself. The current choir director at Grace Community Church has never reported any supernatural experiences, but every Christmas Eve when the children's choir performs Silent Night, longtime parishioners swear they can hear a faint echo of an angelic voice, joining in from somewhere beyond the veil between worlds. And in the church archives, there's a framed photo from the 1995 Christmas service, the last one Lucy Cartwright was supposed to attend. In the background behind the children's choir, there's a small translucent figure in a white dress, smiling as if she finally got to sing her solo after all.